of Holyoke industry, illustrated with maps, vintage photographs, and engravings, and with research drawn from family records and from the archives of 3 libraries. One of the challenges of this project is that almost no company records of the Newton's mills survive. So I welcome all of you to forward or let me know about any additional photographs or records that you know of, or corrections of errors in my talk. My partner in this project is our host and the library's archivist, Eileen Crosby. She and I have worked together more than a year to assemble this story. She's a tremendous resource with a deep understanding of Holyoke history and of the records that do exist. Also, without her efforts, few vintage photographs of the dam and of Newton Mills would be available to us. Many of these images were the work of Milan P. Warner, 1848 to 1903, who I consider to be Holyoke's greatest 19th century photographer. He's relatively unknown and we don't know much about him. There are no photographs of him in spite of the fact he was a photographer. We don't even know how to pronounce his first name, Milan or Milan. I call him Milan. We do know that his Warner ancestors were among the first European settlers in Western Massachusetts. Milan's glass plate negatives were donated to Holyoke Public Library in the 1960s, but they were not widely available until Dr. Crosby found the funds and the staffing to scan them for the state library's Digital Commonwealth website. Today's the first presentation of this paper in full. Please tell any of your friends or family who were unable to join us that Eileen Crosby will make it available on the library's website as soon as she can. The principal characters of this story are 5 sons of James and Esther Newton of Greenfield, men whose role in the early years of Holyoke's industrial boom is almost forgotten. This was the era that immediately followed the Big Bang of Holyoke industry, the formation in 1859 of Holyoke Water Power Company, the economic development firm that built this magnificent dam, the third structure built across Hadley Falls. Our goal is to show you what that early Holyoke actually looked like. Now, the earliest dam to tame the river was built in 1848 by Hadley Falls Company. I've never found an image of that dam, probably because it failed on the first day of operation, November 19, 1848. Many Holyokers have heard this story. The gates were opened at 10 a.m. that morning, and the company's investors got a telegram that afternoon, 3:20 p.m. Your dam has gone to hell by way of Willimantic. That spectacular washout reminds us that a crucial element in this story is the awesome power of the Connecticut River, sometimes called the Mississippi of New England. The other great planned river cities in New England, Manchester, New Hampshire, Lowell, and Lawrence, Massachusetts, the falls in those mill towns all play second fiddle to Hadley Falls, which carries twice the hydropower of any of them. Here's what I mean. Tens of thousands of horsepower carrying away the spring snowmelt from her watershed in New Hampshire, Vermont, and southwest Maine. Our story begins in Greenfield, 30 miles upriver from Holyoke. This is where one of the Connecticut River's largest tributaries, the Deerfield River, empties into the Connecticut. Both rivers have been water routes as long as New England has been inhabited, and for centuries this was the site of a river crossing of east-west footpaths over which Native American tribes could travel to great fishing grounds in the area, or to carry on trade between Massachusetts Bay and the Connecticut and Hudson Valleys. The Newton family got their start here in Greenfield in 1835 and settled where you see the orange compass rose. They could not have known that within 15 years, Greenfield would again become a crossroads, this time for railroads of the Valley's Industrial Revolution. The inset of this 1887 map shows the 3 railroads that began arriving in Greenfield beginning in 1856, the Connecticut River Railroad, the Fitchburg, and the New Haven and Northampton Railroad. Esther and James Newton, then in their early 30s, sold the Hubbardston, Massachusetts farm that 4 generations of Newtons had worked. They loaded their belongings and children into ox carts and determined to find a farm near Greenfield, accompanied by James' ailing father. Ebenezer, his father, had years before discovered the rich river bottoms at Greenfield while on a trip to Saratoga Springs, New York. As for Esther Hale, she endured a hard childhood after her mother died, and her story reminds me of Cinderella. As a girl, she was hired out by her stepmother to work for other families. The stepmother was so cruel, Esther blamed her all her life for the early death of 2 of her sisters. Esther raised 11 children and became a pillar of the Greenfield church the family joined. James Newton was also a devout Christian, as fluid with Bible quotations as any minister. He could recite from memory his favorite, the Gospel of St. John, and he and Esther passed along their religious conviction to their children. In time, they found a farm, saved to build this farmhouse 5 years later. But the lumber for its construction was bought at great expense, for Greenfield had no lumber mills and no railroads. It was clear that a lumber business offered a promising opportunity for a family with 6 capable sons. In 1848, they dammed a small stream behind their house to flood a mill pond for powering a sawmill that would become the foundation of the family's prosperity for years to come. The young company became a classroom for their children, where the boys learned how to handle teams of horses, double entry accounting, and supervising crews of men. James's engineering lessons about water power projects no doubt influenced the boys' future. In addition to all the Greenfield buildings that this mill made possible, it also contributed mightily to Holyoke's industrial development, for much of the lumber that built the city's mills came from this enterprise. The Newton Mill was in the right place to tap into America's Industrial Revolution. UMass Lowell history professor Robert Forant calls this region along the Connecticut the Silicon Valley of the 19th century. In this picture, we see the 6 Newton sons who survived to adulthood, the 3 brothers in front, and Moses on the right in back would soon join forces to become some of the most remarkable entrepreneurs of their time in Western Massachusetts and Southern Vermont. 4 years later, we see the whole family, including their sisters, sweethearts, and children, on Thanksgiving Day, 1860, 160 years ago this week. Mother Esther made sure that their children believed in education, and at least 5 of them began their careers as teachers. The census of 1860 shows that 6 Newton sons and daughters still lived on the Newton farm, including the eldest son, Daniel Newton, on the left in the back row. Although Daniel had gone west, where he taught in a Kentucky school, he returned home to manage the family's new sawmill, allowing his father to continue overseeing the family farm. Daniel also tried his hand at politics. He was one of the founders of the Republican Party in Massachusetts. He would soon become treasurer of Franklin County, a role that he continued throughout the Civil War. After Daniel moved to Holyoke in 1866, he would be elected to a term in the Massachusetts legislature. Daniel's younger brother, John Carter Newton, the tall fellow standing at the center of the back row, was called a giant of a man. John planned for a career in teaching, attending America's first school for training teachers, State Normal School in Westfield. Instead, at the time of this photograph, John and Daniel had just gone into business, signing a contract with their father as partner that would set the course for the rest of their lives. That first contract was a $5,000 award to expand the facility that housed John's alma mater, Westfield State Normal School, today's Westfield State University. Their job was to add a wing to each side of the original school building, so you see it after the work was done. They also were hired to build greenhouses for the towns, gas houses for the towns of Westfield and Greenfield, and you can see Greenfield's round brick gas house in this early photograph. The brothers must have been closely watching progress in Holyoke, just 30 miles by train from Greenfield, where one of the largest engineering projects in New England history to date was underway at the new planned city. The site developed and selected for Holyoke was nearly perfect, undeveloped farmland with a large, moderately sloping plain overlooking a river brimming with water power, and nearby another mill town, Chicopee, where there was a large pool of skilled textile workers who might be lured away with modest wage premiums. The water power wanted Holyoke to foster textile manufacturing. Paper was not at all in their plans. Only 6 years after the Hadley Falls Company was founded, it published this map showing how the Connecticut River Railroad had recently opened through the nearly empty Holyoke site. The canal system that was finally completed in 1893 is remarkably similar to this plan, with the exception of the first level canal, which ultimately would flow not to the river, but into the third level canal here. All of the new company's plans depended upon a strong and lasting Holyoke Dam. This colored engraving is a rare image of the dam that replaced the one that washed away. The old-fashioned clothing of the men and women in the print are a reminder that the United States was just 60 years old when this dam was finished. Like the failed dam, this structure was also built of logs, but it was bolted to pins drilled into the bedrock of the river bottom. Even so, it wasn't long before critics complained that the dam was, quote, simply built with the wrong face upstream. They claimed that this sloping upstream structure that you see here would have been ideal on the downstream side. They complained that its steep vertical face allowed the river's full power to drop with such force that it would eventually break the dam's foundations. Others pointed out the synchronous vibration caused by falling water that made the doors and windows in town rattle. In spite of its shortcomings, though, this dam at Hadley Falls held up. The cost of that original dam disaster was a drag on the company throughout its 10-year existence, and the next serious recession, called the Panic of 1857, was a fatal blow. The company's assets were auctioned to investors in a newly formed corporation, Holyoke Water Power Company. That was Holyoke's big bang. The new company inherited this dam, a canal system that was barely 1/3 complete, and just 4 operating mills. Such limited progress over a decade helps to show that inadequate leadership was another factor in the failure of the Hadley Falls Company. 10 years later, the new water power company began to tackle the dam's design problems. They filled in the eroded pit at the dam's base and added a new sloped dam face of timbers and 6-inch planks on top on the downstream side. These improvements solved the vibration problem and answered critics who lobbied for a sloped downstream dam face. The result was a beautiful sight. Just shy of 1,000 feet in length, it was called the second longest dam in America at the time. You can see from this low water photo, however, that the new apron was not enough of an improvement to overcome the weaknesses of a log dam trying to hold back the river's mighty power. By 1885, planning began on a new stone dam. It would take 8 years of excavation and construction, and that basic structure has served now for 120 years. This diagram shows how engineers built the new stone dam 130 feet downriver from the log dam, using the old dam as a coffer to hold back water during construction. Here you see both dams and the stone dam's much greater distance from the canal water gatehouse here. Here's the gatehouse there with just the short reach to the dam. And here you see the finished dam in all its glory in a 1903 photograph. But back to our story of the Newtons. Soon after finishing their gas house projects in Greenfield and Westfield, Daniel and John Newton began their work in Holyoke in 1862. Their first Holyoke contract was to build these two schools, a grammar school on Lyman Street and the Elm Street School, the city's first high school, which would serve Holyoke for decades. Their fee for building the high school, $8,500. At the time of the Newtons' first contracts, very little had been built in the Canal District. There were still only 4 mills. It was a dismal place, one big construction site plagued by clouds of dust whenever the wind blew. But that was about to change with the arrival of these two dynamos. With their two brothers, James and Moses, the Newtons built 25 mills in Holyoke between 1862 and 1891 in virtually every industry that developed in the region at that time. They constructed, owned, or operated at one point or another 1/2 of the paper mills that were to make Holyoke's reputation as the world's largest center of paper production for decades to come. And Daniel continued to manage the Newtons' Greenfield sawmill, from which they transported bargain-priced Newton lumber to Holyoke by the direct rail connection with Greenfield. All the while, the brothers and their wives were also working pro bono to help to build an array of civic institutions that did not exist when they arrived, and some of which, including this library, have continued to serve Holyoke ever since. The manufacturers of Holyoke quickly realized that housing for workers was fundamental in establishing a stable workforce for their mills. Daniel and John were ready and able to meet that need, both for their own mills and for other mill owners. A few of the dozens of housing structures that the Newtons built have survived, most notably on Newton Street. John, though the youngest of the 4 brothers who made such an impact on Holyoke, was to become the partner's undisputed leader and executive head. He was unquestionably an engineering genius, as you can see from his projects both within and beyond Holyoke. Many of John's out-of-town contracts were undertaken with only limited involvement from Daniel, who focused more on finding venture capital for their Holyoke projects and managing their manufacturing companies. As for John, it was said he built more commercial buildings in Western Massachusetts than any other man of his time. And he somehow found time to pursue railroad construction and operations that took him to America's West. All this demanding work took a toll on John's health, requiring him several times to take months off far away from business in order to regain his strength. John also built the first fishway at Hadley Falls, but it was not successful in solving a problem that still remains: the dam's blockage of the upriver migration of the shad and Atlantic salmon. James Hale Newton was the scholar and the financial genius of the brothers. He was the only 4-year college man in the bunch, graduating Phi Beta Kappa from Dartmouth. After 6 years of teaching and work as a school principal in Worcester, he came to Holyoke in 1864 to become a partner with his brothers. In all, James organized 7 paper mills and patented a process for mixing paper and cotton to make shirt collars, and I think he's wearing one of them now. The company he founded to make paper collars, Franklin Paper, was so successful that in a single year, Franklin Paper consumed 1 million yards of muslin for the paper and cotton blends. James remained in Holyoke for the rest of his life, and 2 of his large houses survive. He outlived all his brothers. This is Moses, though, the 4th brother, who was even more the inventor, but he resisted hiring lawyers to register his patents. Most of his own patent applications proved to be failures, allowing his competitors to profit from his innovations. In later years, Moses became a 19th century version of the road warrior, spending his weeks overseeing Newton operations in Vermont, then taking the train home to Holyoke for the weekend. Of course, it's a lot easier when your family has its own railroad. There were 3 other brothers. Ebenezer died as a teenager, probably of typhus. Joseph never joined in the Holyoke enterprises, and the youngest brother, Solon, was the only bachelor in the bunch. He spent 18 months in Holyoke right after the Civil War, working in the Newton's first paper mill, but he hated it, and he returned to Greenfield to help his father in the lumber company. Of the 4 Newton sisters, none ever lived in Holyoke. Sarah died as an infant. Susan and Laura were both dead within 5 years of the Thanksgiving portrait, and the one sister who lived to old age was Esther, whose son would grow up to work for Esther's brothers in Vermont. This useful map from 1894 includes most of the Newton's Holyoke ventures in real estate and in the manufacturing. Their mills are scattered around the canals, and it was drawn after the canal system was completed. I've marked 3 land tracts, each with an interesting story that illustrate how the brothers' shrewd business skills also benefited the city's development. Various members of the Ely family owned farms on the site that was to become the Canal District. Much of the land had been purchased either by Hadley Falls Company or its successor, the Water Power Company, which was trying to assemble the 1,200 acres that make up the Canal District. But Sam Ely's farm of 40 acres, or Parcel 6, as the company called it, was one of the last lots the power company had been unable to buy. Sam Ely simply did not want to sell to what he called the big company. When its agents came calling, he stuck a musket out of the window and fired. The agent turned and ran. John Newton had recently bought a steam sawmill from one of the Elys for his construction contracts, and he stepped in, convinced Sam Ely to sell him the farm, took out a mortgage, and then turned the mortgaged property over to the Water Power Company for what it cost him. The company awarded him with a nice commission for his trouble. 6 years later, when it was time to build the magnificent city hall that still dominates the city skyline, the Newtons had the perfect site already picked out and in their control, and they sold the land to the city at a bargain price. At roughly the same time the city hall was being built, the Newtons were among manufacturers fighting the rail freight monopoly of the Connecticut River Railroad here. When there was no progress in negotiations with the railroad, the manufacturers charted a new railroad to be built 10 miles west to link to the New Haven and Northampton Railroad. The city bought the controlling shares of this new Holyoke and Westfield Railroad, and spur lines were built along all the canals for maximum access. The Connecticut River Railroad's freight monopoly was broken. When time came to build a freight station for the new railroad, the Newtons had joined with the Water Power Company to find and buy an ideal site to offer the city here, where the Heritage Museum in Holyoke is today on the first level canal. Now, everything but manufacturing plants have been eliminated from this map. So I used a grayscale version of it to color in orange the mills from all industries that the Newtons built, operated, or both. Some people have suggested that the Newtons were primarily mill builders, but in fact, they were involved in starting and running more paper mills than any other Holyoke family. We'll use this for our tour of the Newton Mills of Holyoke. Note the north directional in the upper left and the dam and water gate in upper right. At the top of the map is the first level canal reaching from the gatehouse by the dam to extend southwest across 12 blocks. The second level canal has two branches, and the upper western branch was originally called the Raceway. It drains into the third level canal. I call the eastern channel of the second level the Riverside branch of the second level canal. When completed, it also drained through pipes underground into the third level canal. The third level canal is the shortest and of course the lowest and has a major outlet to the river. For our 19th century photographic journey along Holyoke's canals, my sequence is to follow the flow of water, which moves right to left on the map, except for the third level, which flows down and then left to right. By using a geographic sequence instead of a chronological one, this can be the basis for a cell phone tour of the canal system that Eileen and I are planning. In this image of the first level canal, the compass rose highlights the canal level and marks the location of the camera in the photograph on the right. The second, I'm sorry. Note in this slide that only half of the canal system, here in black, had been excavated by the time of this drawing, 1870. As demand for canal-side mill space revived after the Civil War, in 1871, the Newtons made a deal with the water power company to extend by 2 blocks the development of real estate along the first level canal. No records of this agreement exist, but we know that it involved grading the area and building mills, and it seems likely that John Newton was also expected to do this, the first canal excavation in a decade. When the work was complete, the water power company was inspired by the Newtons' success to undertake other mill and canal extensions on their own. In 1862, the Newtons built on the first level canal their earliest Holyoke industry, a wire mill for William Rice. This mill is a story about lost opportunities and new industrial frontiers. Rice was one of America's pioneers in metal wire manufacture. Making wire takes a great deal of power. At the same time, paper making had taken hold in Holyoke, and paper machine used large amounts of wire to support felting systems that shed water. Unfortunately, Rice and his wire artisans in this mill were recruited away by manufacturers in Worcester just 2 years after the mill was built. Over the coming decades, Worcester became the nation's premier wire-making center. With the great water power of Hadley Falls and paper manufacturers' demand right on the site, Holyoke could have dominated America's wire-making industry. There was little time for the Newtons to worry about the loss of that mill operation, however. New manufacturing horizons beckoned. They had already ventured into paper mill construction for themselves when William Whiting, an agent for David Butterfield's Holyoke Power Company and one of Holyoke's most illustrious power makers, approached Daniel and John with his plan to go out on his own and build his first mill. The just finished wire building was bought, and it was expanded threefold to become Whiting Mill Number 1. You can see how we have colored the brick red wire mill to show how it was embedded in the larger Whiting Mill. This building was torn down only 5 years ago. Continuing down the first canal, James Newton built and operated Waregan Paper, his first venture into making book papers, and his son Edward eventually took over as manager of the mill. This is one of Mylan Warner's photographs. Massasoit Paper Company was also built by the Newtons to produce high-grade linen papers. When William Skinner's mill in Williamsburg, Massachusetts was demolished in 1874 by floodwaters from a failed dam, James Newton approached him on behalf of the water power company to consider rebuilding in Holyoke. The Newton brothers' teamwork was on full display, with James representing the water power company and Daniel pitching how the Newtons could get Skinner's mill up and running quickly. On the morning after Skinner signed his agreement with the water power company, John Newton's work crews were at the new canal site to begin construction. The Skinner Company's growth was astonishing, and by 1922, its facilities were considered the largest silk factory in the world. Far Alpaca Company was also recruited by the Newton brothers, who helped to persuade Herbert Farr of Ontario to relocate his fledgling textile mill to Holyoke. The demand for Far Alpaca's luxury cashmere, mohair, and alpaca woolens accelerated with the expansion of automobile ownership, which required warm clothing for riding in open cars. That boom went bust, however, when enclosed automobiles equipped with heaters became the rage. But Far Alpaca went on to become the largest employer in Holyoke, driven in large part by World War I military contracts. The mill the Newtons built for the Connor brothers made woolen factory for clothing. Onto the second level canal, the raceway. The compass rose here is placed next to the mill that is seen under construction in the photograph, which was the second mill of Parsons Paper Company, the first paper producer in Holyoke. It was not built by the Newtons. The ivy-covered building in this photograph by Warner was the first major paper manufacturer built and operated by the Newtons. This was just the third paper mill to open in Holyoke. You can see the City Hall in the background. First was Parsons Paper, 1853, then Hadley Paper Company, 1857. Hamden Paper was the first paper enterprise that was established after the Water Power Company took over development of Holyoke. Later, this mill was acquired by Beebe and Holbrook and devoted to the manufacture of writing papers and such specialty products as wedding folios. Here you can see where their drainage from the water wheels empties back into the canal from the upper canal. The Newtons were early leaders in wood paper technology, which led to the construction of this plant for processing spruce and poplar waste into pulp. A major fire reduced its capacity, and the Newtons would continue to struggle to get all the wood pulp fiber their mills required. The Newtons built this cutlery factory, which brought European expertise to Holyoke for the production of shears and scissors for use with sheep, textiles, paper, household use. J.C. Smith Machine Company was originally built by the Newtons and then later taken over by Goddard Machine Company to manufacture metalworking machinery. Moses Newton was briefly president of the Goddard, probably because he held a mortgage from Smith on the property. The Newtons built this mill for a firm that manufactured butcher knives and table cutlery, producing 240 dozen units per day by the 1880s. This mill was one of the few Newton mills that they built and also operated that was outside the paper industry. Produced here were a wide variety of fasteners, especially flathead and wood screws. It was a favorite mill of Daniel, who remained involved in its management for many years. Holyoke Machine Company was a large and remarkable company in the city's history. The Newtons built its first factory. From the beginning, Holyoke Machine was a vital part of outfitting Holyoke's mills, thanks to its large foundry, its metal finishing equipment, and blacksmith operations. The mechanical connections of Holyoke mills, where engineering, gears, and shaftings that are tied to water wheels was a special talent of the Newton brothers, and they worked closely with Holyoke Machine for many years. The company's resident engineering genius in the early years was John B. McCormick, who designed world-famous water turbines and wheels for the company. When Holyoke Machine Company was shuttered in 2017, it had operated for 154 years, the oldest manufacturer in Holyoke. One of its most famous contracts was to cast the doors for the U.S. Capitol building in Washington. This mill was built by the Newtons for Chester Chapin, Springfield's banking and railroad magnate, who was president of the Connecticut River Railroad. Its business was to make cotton warp thread for textile production. The Riverside Canal, the Riverside branch of the second canal, which runs along here. And you can see that the compass rose marks the Hadley Company, which is seen in the photograph. Although it was not a Newton mill, this thread factory is one of the most distinguished 19th century mills still standing in Holyoke. Hamden Paper Mill number 2 was built by the Newtons specifically to manufacture their collar paper system. Changing men's fashions led to the sale of the factory to the Crocker family and their partners, which shifted its production to ornamental papers. The Albion Mill is a handsome work. It has been only 5 years since Holyoke lost it to fire and the wrecking ball. It was built and operated by the Newtons and was the earliest known design of the Towers brothers, 2 architects working in Holyoke at the time. It produced book, envelope, and writing paper with a large capacity, 20 tons per day. Originally built for the Winona Paper Company, this picture shows excavations of the canal in front of the mill, probably in 1880. 10 years later, Winona was sold in foreclosure and bought by George C. Gill, who had started in Holyoke as a business manager for the Newtons. Moses Newton served as the first president of the revamped company, which became one of the largest fine writing paper mills in the city, producing 20 tons per day. The last plant built by the Newtons in 1891, the Norman Paper Company, was also their most lavish, with executive offices paneled in California redwood with antique oak furnishings. 6 million bricks went into its construction. Its stylish industrial design was one of the last projects undertaken in the city by the Tower brothers, who left Holyoke for New York around this time, a sign that Holyoke's go-go period of expansion had ended. When the Norman came online in 1892, the mill contributed to the glut of writing paper producers in Holyoke, which accelerated the emergence of the National Paper Trust. Corporate trusts were Gilded Age corporate tools. Their purpose was to achieve monopoly powers through mergers and syndicates in order to control prices and lobby for favorable governmental tariffs. The domination of the industrial trusts during the 1890s in America helped to propel Teddy Roosevelt to power as their vocal opponent. Of the paper companies that merged to form the paper trust, it was known as American Writing Paper Company, nearly half of its member firms had ties to the Newtons. When the trust tried to gain control of this mill, Norman Paper, James Newton resisted for a time. Then he surprised the city by giving in. And this mill is the only significant relic of the Newton mills left in Holyoke. Today, it's abandoned, a forlorn ghost complex. Lastly, the third level canal. And the compass rose here marks the camera's location in this vintage Mylan Warner photograph of Chemical Paper Company. It's now the site of Hazen Paper, still operating, but it was operated by the Newtons for many years. However, the first mill on this level is A.T. Stewart and Company, which produced cashmere textiles. Here we see the chemical power site again in an aerial photograph from the late 1930s. This mill, built on 21 acres, was called in 1880 the largest soda pulp paper mill in the world. It was here that the Newtons pioneered new technologies for producing paper, not from rags, cotton and linen, etc., but from wood pulp. And later they made manila writing, envelope, and lithographic papers, as well as wrapping and cover papers. Originally, the paper mill also included a Newton pulp mill and sawmill. One major contract for chemical paper was to manufacture Western Union's telegram blanks. After the formation in 1899 of the Writing Paper Trust, American Writing Paper Company, the chemical continued to make wood pulp paper as one of the 6 or so independent mills left in Holyoke, and its 50-ton daily capacity made it the largest independent paper manufacturer in the city. Newton Paper was the pet of Mose Newton, and with its location at the end of the canal system, it was described to me by his granddaughter as a mud mill. What she meant was that the canal water that finally reached the Newton had passed through many mills and was no longer clean enough to wash fine writing paper. Instead, the mill made coarse papers to sheathe buildings, corrugated carpet lining, and manila wrappers. It survived until 1960 in the Newtons' hands when it was bought by a South Carolina firm, Southern Novelty Company, today Sunoco, which operates it to produce recycled paper for its packaging products. In spite of the third level canal's overused water supply, the mill here on the right produced rag-based book and press paper and was built close to a textile company next door, Springfield Blanket Company. This was a loom mill from another time. Springfield Blanket specialized in horse blankets. As that business waned, the firm moved into bed covers, and it survived well into the 20th century. At the end of the third level canal is Franklin Paper Company, which was the plant built and operated by James Newton to manufacture the collar paper that he invented. Later, it was retooled to produce book and envelope paper. Eventually acquired by James Ramage and his sons, it was a family, the Ramages was a family closely allied to the Newtons that would join them in their Vermont ventures. Holyoke's paper companies increasingly turned to marketing tools to compete for market share, and these are some of the best that the Newtons produced of their logos for companies they operated. Esther was the first of the Newtons' parents to die in 1885. One tribute after her death mentions she had so much executive ability and sound instincts that her sons eagerly sought her advice as they laid plans for their various businesses. Their father, James, lived 6 years after Esther's death. He had often partnered with his sons, taught them mechanical skills as boys, and served as director of at least one of their companies, Massachusetts Screw. James was very proud of his son's achievements, and their many ventures brought the entire family a level of prosperity that James could not have imagined when he established his farm in Greenfield. A real estate map of the town, published soon after his death, showed that James had invested his earnings in real estate, owning at least 10 cottages and farms in his neighborhood, and he left an estate valued at $100,000, worth almost $3 million in today's dollars. By the time of Esther's death, the Newton brothers had begun to shift their entrepreneurial energies beyond Holyoke. As paper making expanded in the city, a major factor for the Newtons was the growing shortage of wood pulp for their paper making. But there were other concerns. The extension of the canals had stalled, the number of paper mills had grown dramatically, and the canal's supply of water for paper washing and for water power seemed to be reaching their limits for the near future. Vermont beckoned. Now, Mylan Warner took these views of Holyoke from the City Hall tower, and they show how the city's grid was growing ever more crowded in the late 19th century. Anyone familiar with these sections of the city will be amazed at how little of this architectural fabric survives. The small Newton sawmill in Greenfield was too small to be a player in meeting New England's insatiable demands for wood products in the booming 1870s, and continuing shortages of wood pulp for their mills reminded the Newtons of the vast forests of southern Vermont, virgin timber, that they had seen on fishing trips up the Deerfield River. The region offered a seemingly endless supply of pulp and lumber and business opportunities. 12 miles up the Deerfield River from this railroad, it lies Reedsboro, Vermont. Here there was a dramatic drop in elevation along the river, and construction of a dam and pulp mill by the Newtons was soon underway. John Newton engineered a 57-foot high dam to impound a 20-acre pond where timber from spring log runs could be stored behind canal booms. From the pond, this canal led water around the ridge to the mill's turbines, employing an 80-foot drop in elevation between the top of the dam and the lowest level of this pulp mill, one of the largest in the nation. Holyoke Machine Company made water turbines of the finest caliber, and their equipment was installed in this mill to produce the major water power needed for pulp grinding machinery. This mill could process 35 cords of timber each season. Feeding the mills was a challenge, but these crews you see here began almost 20 years of Newton logging in Vermont. Their crews hauled cut timber to the frozen river late in the winter, then muscled the logs downriver to the mill pond after the spring thaw. It was treacherous work. As they harvested the spruce forest for pulp, the maple, pine, beech, and ash were cut for a large chair factory the Newtons built in Reedsboro. Using machinery driven by steam engines and water power, you can see there's a dam here in the foreground on the right. The company made schoolroom desks, folding tables, church pews, chairs for home and opera house, as well as deck chairs for ocean liners, including the ill-fated SS Titanic. Their products won an award at the 1893 World's Fair. You can see drying lumber stacked everywhere on the site. But even before the products of the furniture factory began to fill their warehouses in Reedsboro, the brothers realized that transport of the pulp mill's output was an even bigger problem than they anticipated. It took 40 horses to haul one day's output from the pulp mill to the Massachusetts Railroad line at Hoosick Tunnel. Perhaps John, Daniel, and Moses knew from the start that only a rail line would meet their needs, because in barely 2 years they had received a narrow gauge railroad charter for what came to be known as the Hoosick Tunnel and Wilmington Railroad. Its nickname became the Hoot Toot and Whistle, and impatient passengers called it the Halt There and Wait. Narrow gauge rails are 3 feet apart compared to standard gauge rails separated by 4 feet 6 inches. Across those rugged 12 miles to the Hoosick Tunnel, John Newton proved his engineering mettle by solving the challenges of many sharp curves and steep grades. Initially, the railroad only extended from Reedsboro to the major rail line running between Boston and New York State. The new railroad enabled construction of this rail bridge across the Deerfield River for a spur link to Reedsboro Village and their chair factory, but it also connected that remote mountain town to the modern world in the flatlands below. The tiny farm village of Reedsboro soon became Bennington County's largest industrial boom of the day, with 12 new industries established in Reedsboro in just 4 years. Other industries followed, and the Ramage family, their partners in Holyoke papermaking, signed on as railroad investors and built their own paper mill town, Monroe Bridge, on the Massachusetts side of the state line crossed by the Hoosick Tunnel and Wilmington Railroad. Meanwhile, the Newtons were not the only entrepreneurs aware of the region's hunger for forest products. In 1870, this company launched the first of 40 years of huge Connecticut River log runs. In the largest log run America has ever seen, down the Connecticut, 15 loggers and 50 horses cut 600,000 logs to float 200 miles downriver. Holyoke was one of the 3 major destinations for the logs, which were corralled behind chain booms just north of the city, making lumber soon the 3rd largest of Holyoke's industries, after textiles and paper. The Connecticut River Lumber Company built another mill by Mount Tom, up by the oxbow of the Connecticut River. By 1892, the company had added a very large pulp mill, this bulk brick building in the rear, in which bark and other wood waste was crushed and cooked in chemicals to produce wood pulp. And the Newtons had no investment in any of these logging enterprises, but the pulp mill would do much to overcome Holyoke's regular shortages of the basic ingredient of wood paper. As their pulp production and railroad transport began to solve the Newtons' pulp needs in Holyoke, the brothers launched a specialty paper mill in Reedsboro that could tap their pulp supply on site. They partnered with Philadelphia to produce pulp board boxes with metal reinforced corners. You've probably seen this product today. These boxes were used for packaging luxury products. The pulp board for those boxes poured out of this monstrous machine. This was the longest paper machine in the US at that time, 225 feet long. This mill continued to be a profitable venture for 3 decades until the most feared enemy of the manufacturer ended it all, a disastrous mill fire in 1922, after the Newtons had sold their share of the company to their Philadelphia partners. As they acquired more timber rights north of Reedsboro, and with financial support from the town of Wilmington, the Newton Brothers Railroad was extended 12 miles to Wilmington, 5 years after the first railroad began operating. That expansion made possible their largest lumber operation of all. And this is a spillway. This is a train line running over the spillway for a 1/4 mile long dam. The railroad extension and their web of lumber leases and logging crews made possible this large lumber and pulp operation just west of Wilmington at Mountain Mills on the Deerfield River. The mill's saws were driven by steam produced from burning saw wastes. 100 workers served the mill operation with 200 more men upriver in the woods, cutting each year 8 to 10 million board feet of lumber for the mills. Soon, Mountain Mills was Windham County's largest employer. The Newtons continued to operate several paper mills in Holyoke, but for the Newtons, like all of us, change is the only constant. Competence is the word that epitomized this man, John Carter Newton, and his human force was evident at several locations at one time. Here's an example from Holyoke. When the Water Power Company's huge Cabot Street mill caught fire in 1888 on a bitterly cold winter day, there were problems getting water on the fire. John appeared on the scene, ran a hose from the fire to one of the Newton's mills, and played a major role in saving 3 wings of that big factory, which would continue to serve as a startup incubator for Holyoke companies for more than a quarter century. And at the same time, he was supposed to be building railroads in Missouri and Iowa and launching new ventures in Vermont. At the crescendo of the Newtons' economic miracle in Vermont, this man, who was both the leader and the youngest of the Newton entrepreneurs in Holyoke, was struck down in 1899. He suffered an intense appendix attack while he was in his Wilmington vacation home, the first of Holyoke's Newton patriarchs to die. It was an emotional and financial shock for the family. His death began a period of withdrawal from Vermont for the Newtons. Moses, who had long shared with John much of the load for the Newtons' Green Mountain empire, now had to assume leadership for the family's businesses there. He did so capably in his own eccentric way, but age was slowing them all down, and by 1906, the brothers had sold most of their Vermont operations, including the railroad, the mountain mills and Reedsboro factories, and some 125,000 acres of timber rights. 2 years after John's death in 1901, Solon Newton, the youngest of the sons and daughters of James and Esther, passed away at age 60 in Greenfield. We know from his diaries that he was often ill. As a small child, he had eaten a nearly fatal dose of potash. Solon never married. Instead, as he grew older, he built a house in Greenfield near James and Esther, whom he took care of as their health declined. True to his roots, he was a devoted member of the family's church, not missing a service for 15 years, teaching Sunday school and leading the church choir. He also became one of the first collectors in Western Massachusetts of early American furniture, art, and other antiquities, and he donated many of his treasures to the Memorial Hall Museum in Deerfield, and you see the pewter from his collection. Solon also managed the Newton sawmill in Greenfield after their father's health failed, and Solon's death only added more business burdens for his brothers to manage from long distance. As for Daniel's legacy, he showed throughout his career how his skills with people and his civic commitments could help the brothers' businesses to grow while making Holyoke an attractive place to live. One tribute remarked on Daniel's devotion to the city beautiful landscaping principles of his time. That helps us to understand why he took time to volunteer as city forester and as a member of the Parks Commission. It was for these contributions that Newton Street in Holyoke was named for Daniel. Other than service to his church, Moses was not an active civic volunteer. Instead, we remember Moses for his Yankee thrift when it came to lawyers' fees, a stubbornness that cost him dearly. But his thrifty nature could also inspire innovation. In addition to his regular efforts to introduce to Holyoke paper makers the latest techniques for lowering the cost of paper production, he pioneered new ways to recover for reuse the milling waste that would otherwise be dumped in the river. Moses had gold and silver fever. He owned rights to a Colorado silver mine and opened a gold mine at the Mountain Mills complex. For years, his son wore a tie pin studded with a large nugget that probably represented much of the ore that was actually mined there. Moses was known for his wry sense of humor, and his daughter-in-law wrote that the Newtons were a very religious family, well-versed in the Bible, but full of fun. Moses especially enjoyed telling and hearing good stories. One reporter called Moses undoubtedly the most original and most witty of the famous Newton brothers. And from another writer years later, it used to be said that when Moses laughed, you could hear it at Mount Tom. James Newton's legacy was great. When it came to community service, none of the brothers could match James's record. In addition to the contributions listed here, he was also a leader in his church and in his college's alumni affairs. Although James was never involved in the Vermont ventures, he built a vacation home in Wilmington to escape summer's heat. His life truly revolved around Holyoke, and 2 of his Holyoke residences survive today. His obituary described James as a dignified, courteous man who tried to better the lives of the workers who lived in the housing built for his mills. Oops. When the Newton brothers came to Holyoke in 1862, it was pretty dreary, a treeless, dust-blown plain. The new industries led to a population boom in the 1870s when the number of residents grew 50% in just 7 years. The canals became open sewers that doomed the city to a polluted water supply until reservoirs were built west of the city on Mount Tom. But the Newton's great works with other leaders led to the prosperous and vigorous city that they bequeathed to their children and grandchildren. Their efforts spoke not just to their enterprise, but to their sense of decency and civic responsibility. They made mistakes, mills that failed, and inventions they squandered. James was said to make a fortune, lose it, to make another, and lose it too. And John was tried for mail fraud during his years building railroads out west. The case alleged that his railroad had loaded mail cars with bales of scrap paper to inflate the weight of mail his railroad was transporting. John was ultimately acquitted of all the charges. What is undeniable is the huge role all 5 men played in building industrial Holyoke. They deserve to be celebrated and remembered. I'm grateful to all of you for your interest. Eileen and I have dedicated this work to my mother-in-law, Alice Newton Child Smith, who first captured my interest with her stories of the Newton brothers. And it's fitting that this talk is hosted by Holyoke Public Library because Alice was a longtime trustee, a donor, and fundraiser for the library. That was my grandson calling. I'm most indebted to Alice's daughter, who has I am most indebted to Alice's daughter, my wife Eliza, who has patiently answered Newton family questions for decades, and to a fellow retirement historian, Brian Donaldson, who I hope is on the phone today on the Zoom call. And Brian's 2-volume History of the Newton's Years in Vermont, titled The Coming of the Train, is at the heart of what we know of those ventures. And thank you again to my project partner, Eileen Crosby, and back to you.
Thank you, Will. That was wonderful. I'm going to mute you so you can take your phone call if you need to, just for a second. No, that was great.